Whoa, paper joke. Okay. Paper Mario. You might have heard of it if you're a fan of contentious debates within online fan bases. While I'm not a fan of the violent debate surrounding the series, I am fascinated by the reason for it. The Paper Mario series started out as an RPG and gradually, or actually quite suddenly, became an action-adventure series. I've only ever played Super Paper Mario, and that entry is considered so separate from the rest of the series that it gets its own sub-debate outside of the fight between RPG and action-adventure, so I've always wanted to learn about the shift with the rest of the series and what was lost or gained through each title. Watching tons of videos of Paper Mario fans wasn't exactly giving me what I wanted, so I followed the age-old saying, if you want to learn about a video game, then actually play it. For like an hour or two at least. So join me as we go through Paper Mario's journey through multiple genres. I could have written that better. Paper Mario released on the N64 in 2000 whatever. The game was originally designed as Super Mario RPG 2, a sequel to the other game that people also like. So that's one major question answered, already on a roll. Though to set it apart from the rest, this game focused on one main gimmick: platforming. You barely jump at all in other RPGs, so making jumping such a core part of the whole game was a very novel concept. But the game was still very much an RPG, and the first of this format, and I gotta say, the RPG started out with a resounding, it's alright. And since saying something's just alright on the internet is basically the same as advocating murder, I'm off to a great start. But let's cut the chit-chat and get down to the nitty-gritty details of why this game made me feel like advocating murder. The start of the game felt very slow. Lots of dialogue, lots of cutscenes, and an incredibly slow scripted battle, all just to tell you that Bowser kidnapped Peach. Slow starts are expected of RPGs, but I'd argue that it being an expected downside is worse than if it was just something that future titles could have fixed. Which, I mean, they might, so let's hold off full judgment until then. Also, the fact that 90% of the battles in the prologue stopped you to give you a tutorial wasn't fun either. This wasn't helped by the fact that combat overall felt incredibly slow and boring at the start. Not having action commands in a Paper Mario game felt like playing Sonic 1 and pulling out one of these moves. Later on, combat felt significantly more enjoyable when I was actually able to do more than one hit at a time. But near the end of my time playing, I started skipping some battles because I was just getting tired of them. I didn't end up skipping as many battles as I wanted though, because I didn't want to fall behind in levels. This obviously all comes down to my personal preference as someone who doesn't really like RPG combat, but does this mean that I'm admitting that this isn't an entirely fair assessment? Obviously. This whole thing is just me going through my opinions on each game, but don't worry, there'll be more to get mad at later. Story-wise, it was, again, slow at first, but the reason RPGs start slow is so that their stories can be fleshed out better. There were distinct characters I actually liked, which I only have to specify because my impression from online discussion is that this is a luxury I can't take for granted in later titles. Partners were fun too. If there were characters you really liked, then the idea of them joining your party so you get to interact with them more and use them in battle is really cool. I'm a bit sad that they don't do a whole lot after they actually join you, but hold on to that thought. Back to the story specifically, I enjoyed the intermissions between each chapter. The first time it's just a bunch of text, which isn't fun, but every time after that, you get to play as Peach, and let me tell ya, I love getting to play as not Mario. So that was already loads of fun. But I also really enjoy the dynamic of Peach and Bowser in any game that actually explores it more in depth like this. And lastly, but most importantly, paper. You may not realize it yet, but paper is one of the three major aspects of each game that we need to look at, right next to story and combat. So for now, it is worth noting that outside of simple cosmetic flourishes with the world changing, there were only 2 instances of very explicit paper-related jokes, with the jokes being just subtle physical gags rather than dialogue. But with how much praise Thousand Year Door gets, I'm hopeful that the small issues I had with 64 will be fixed. So let's see, shall we? This game follows the same classic RPG format as the previous title. Turn-based battles, heavy emphasis on story and characters, prominently placed noose at the center of town, the works. But unlike most RPGs, this one actually starts out fairly quickly. A decent chunk of dialogue, but then straight into the first battle, and immediately I was super thankful that we not only had the hammer and action commands already, but also that the battle tutorial was short. Just a simple, hit 'em with your attacks. Maybe tutorials won't be as much of an issue with these games as I thought. Okay, sorry, I've deceived you again. I can't trust anything this guy says anymore. I bet he's never even seen a paper before. Yeah, sorry. Once Goombella officially joins our party, the tutorial for how her abilities work is way longer than in 64. And once we get to Professor Frankly, all of the tutorials that we didn't get at the start get dumped on us now. So in the end, they just pushed a lot of the slower, more boring starting stuff to a bit later. Though this is actually exactly like what 64 did, but it felt way more restrictive in 64, so the added freedom in Thousand Year Door made the intro battle feel less boring, but also made the tutorials later feel a bit more disappointing. It's nice that you can still skip some of the tutorial text, unlike some other Nintendo RPGs, but overall, tutorial length is just an issue the RPG titles haven't shown they can fully fix yet. But that's not the only similarity between the basic structure of 64 and TTYD. Most aspects of how the story and characters are treated in the two games are quite similar. The slow setup is there to establish a big overarching story. There were a lot of characters I ended up liking a ton, and their side stories were more than enough to make up for the relatively straightforward main story. You also get an intermission in between each chapter to cover a story between Peach and one of the villains where you get to play as Peach, which again, for a Mario hater like me, this is amazing. Unfortunately, the Peach sections were a tad more boring to me, due to them mostly being a whole lot of AI computer learns what love is from a human, rather than the fun dynamic with Bowser. I just prefer Bowser, what can I say? In fact, he isn't involved at all with the main story, which is unfortunate that... Oh, never mind. He has an incredibly fun side story, where you even get to play as him. I stay winning. Speaking of segues, here's another reason to hate me and my opinions. I found it disappointing that 4 of the new partners in TTYD essentially do the same thing as partners from the original game. 3 of them are the same species too, and 2 of the remaining 4 partners have a slight overlap with 64. Now, the basic functions that these duplicate partners provide are certainly useful, but it isn't promising that it's only the second game with partners, and it's already having to overlap so much. Although, Vivian fulfills that strangely specific desire I mentioned earlier, with liking NPCs enough to want them as party members. Vivian was just a recurring villain, one that I liked quite a bit, and then later in the game she just decides to join your party. Miss Mouse does a similar thing, even being a completely optional partner. And since this game adds a ton of unique dialogue for partners and cutscenes too, this really satisfies people who like these characters enough to want to travel with them more. The battle system, though, was an RPG battle system. As I said, not usually a fan, but for some reason, I didn't really dislike it as much here. Despite the fact that this game's first chapter took the longest to complete out of all of them, spoilers, sorry, I never fully disliked doing battles. It still got a tad annoying near the end and I did skip a couple battles, but for the amount of time I spent doing them, this was a vast improvement over 64. I feel like this is probably due to the combination of the game giving you action commands and a partner right out of the gate, first strikes now allowing you to do action commands, and the ability to keep timing presses after doing an action command to get these stylish moves, which ultimately did nothing for me most of the time, but was a strangely satisfying mechanic. But now for the fun part. Paper. Oh, wow, you can fold yourself into origami as a key gameplay mechanic. I doubt they'd ever bring something like this back to the series, but outside of these abilities you gain, there aren't many other paper-related gags nor goofs. And while I don't really have an opinion one way or the other about this paper stuff yet, I'll say that it's neat having these mechanics that could exist in other forms, but just have this really simple, charming paper twist to them. Like being able to go through tight gaps by flipping on the other axis. I sure do hope that the next game expands on that one mechanic specifically. So, the series hit the Wii, and since the Wii is for casuals, this game couldn't be an RPG. How would my grandmother understand turn-based combat? It's far too intense. Okay, but honestly, I don't know why this game changed from an RPG with platforming mechanics to a platformer with RPG mechanics, but here we are. This is the game I grew up with. There's a lot of nostalgia here, but going back to it has reminded me of a few of my issues with it. The story starts quite slowly. That's just always going to be an issue I bring up with every game, even if it's never going to be a major one. Though this time was worse than the previous two because it was just dialogue and cutscenes. Another issue is that the pixels just aren't fun partners. They tried to give them some personality, but I honestly never got attached to any of them as a kid. The only one that stands out in my mind is the ground pound one who just talks about girth repeatedly. And I say ground pound one because I rarely remember their names too. In some ways, the unique abilities of the pixels does kind of ease my worries about how many repeats there were in Thousand Year Door, but overall, the way the partners here were done was just a huge step down. But that doesn't mean there aren't characters to enjoy. Count Black, Natasha, Dementio, Mimi... okay, not him. But the villains were all really fun characters. And I wish Dementio could join my party, I love him so much. Though who can join the party are Peach, Bowser, and Luigi. And you even get to play as them, which I'm sure you can guess my stance on. Just imagine how fun non-Mario games are to me. These three all keep their personality and charm that they had in previous games, but now you get to travel with them, fulfilling the arbitrary requirement of characters I enjoy. And even though the pixels don't chime in during cutscenes, the party members do. And there's a ton of unique dialogue depending on who you are in each cutscene. Unless you're Mario, because he doesn't talk. The list of reasons to be a Mario hater grows each day. So I love most of the characters, but I also love the story in this game. I love that the overarching plot isn't just bad guy has/wants ancient power and also kidnapped Peach. I can't wait for the future games to keep this up. I'd argue that this is the first game where the main story is one that I'm really invested in too. Is this an unfair advantage of nostalgia? For sure. I can't be as in love with the stories of the first two games when I don't have as much of an attachment to them, but thankfully that doesn't really matter. To me, Super Paper Mario proves the big benefits of the complex story style that the first three games follow. But what about the part of Super that is entirely different from the previous two games? It gets a bit tedious to constantly switch between both the party members and the pixels throughout the game, but besides that, gameplay overall is more fun to me. Again, I won't even pretend that this is a fair and just opinion. We've already established that I just don't like RPG combat. But surprisingly, I don't prefer the combat in this game as strongly over the combat in TTYD as I thought I would. Combat in Thousand Year Door was a lot of fun, and unfortunately Super Paper Mario has a bit too little variety for my liking. I think bringing back a more proper partner system could help with that. Lots of partners in the first two games could already do things in the overworld, so it wouldn't be too hard to get them into this new combat style, and that would again shake things up so that we're not having a lot of repeats. But despite Super's combat being less polished, I find it a lot more promising than the turn-based combat of the first two titles. I can't wait for future games to keep this up. Overall, I'd say the story is still the highlight for me here. I'm proud to be part of the less than 1% of players who enjoyed it. Oh, yeah, I guess I should mention that now. See, while Super Paper Mario was less of an RPG because the Wii is for casuals or something, the next game was going to be another RPG. But then, for a variety of reasons, like an official survey saying that only 1% of players enjoyed the story of Super Paper Mario, Nintendo no longer allowing spin-offs to make new original characters in the Mario universe, and the fact that there was already a Mario-related RPG series going, every Paper Mario game since Super has strayed away from the RPG genre. And this is really where the divide began. Or where the crease began. Or tear. Whatever paper pun you think would work. This one wasn't as bad as I was expecting, but it still wasn't a great start for this format. The game started with one big cutscene that felt too long with so little happening, and with no dialogue to keep things interesting at all, it just wasn't great. But previous games cheated in this regard by always having the big, obnoxiously long setup cutscene play before you even start the game. And I don't think it's necessarily ideal that those games leave out pretty important setup as just an intro movie that you can skip. But I did like that you could skip those. After Sticker Star's cutscene was over, it was good. Just walking around Toad Town, peeling stickers, talking to characters, that was pretty fun. Obviously, this whole ordeal was very explicitly paper. It's far more blatant than previous titles, but it only really became a problem for me when they just kept doing jokes about it. Like, it wasn't a huge issue, but the paper-related jokes very quickly went from, oh, that's clever, to, okay, he's in a trash can. But after all of that jovial fun, the Goombas arrived. I had heard the horrors of the battle system, and I was ready to face it. The battles weren't nearly as slow and obnoxious as the start of the N64 game, thanks to action commands being built in from the start, and the entire combat tutorial just being, see those stickers, use them to hit things. A couple small tutorials showed up later, but I didn't find them nearly as annoying as earlier titles. That doesn't mean combat was fun or anything, I still got sick of battles pretty quickly. Eventually, I really only battled enemies just to have a reason to clear out some stickers in a slightly more fun way than just throwing them out, but later I stopped even doing that. It wasn't a painful battle system, and in some ways it was more enjoyable to me that I didn't feel obligated to do battles when I didn't want to, but it still wasn't ideal. Similar case with the story. The only semi-interesting character was whatever her name was, the Sticker Crown, which you can really tell I got super invested in because I remembered her real name. I'm fine with a game not having a story, and lacking one isn't strictly worse, but unfortunately I didn't find the gameplay fun enough to make up for there being no story to motivate me to keep playing. It was just kind of a junk food game. Something to play when you feel like playing something, but not something that will completely revolutionize your mind and stick with you to the end of time. I have no personal problem with games like that, but I can understand how getting a bag of Cheetos when you were expecting a steak dinner could be a big disappointment to people. But I was expecting to be able to play as not Mario, so clearly this franchise is dead to me. The backlash to Sticker Star from fans of the old titles was pretty massive, but that game didn't make as much of a splash as this. So remember when I said that Thousand Year Door was the game that I played the longest? That was a lie. It was actually Color Splash. Thousand Year Door took 2.5 hours, Color Splash took 3.5, and I didn't even end up getting the first paint star. But no matter why you think that all is, I'm sure you're partly right. The intro cutscene was alright. There was no dialogue, but it didn't really need it, because it was already a significantly more interesting cutscene to me than Sticker Star's, even if it was kind of the same setup as Thousand Year Door. However, the fun of the intro died as it lived. Short. There were a lot more slow cutscenes, and then a surprisingly long battle tutorial. Sticker Star gave me hope that tutorial length wouldn't be an issue with the action-adventure titles, but I guess this combat is still just as complicated as before. I also almost immediately found battles tedious. Maybe I was just getting sick of RPG battles after 3 games of it, but the way the cards were set up was just not fun at all. And because of this, I fell fully into the trap of already disliking something enough that little problems became bigger problems in my mind. Like, I found it annoying that the first few battles of the game were all scripted so you couldn't first strike them, but even when you could first strike, it just wasn't as satisfying since you usually only needed to use 1 card per enemy anyway. The paint upgrades, which serve as the level up system, only annoyed me with how awkward and slow they felt, and I somehow even felt like there was too much dialogue in the game. It was a grueling and painfully slow slog. But then, an hour and a half into the game, something broke through my spiral of negativity. I don't know what or how, but I'm very thankful it did, because the dialogue immediately became so much more enjoyable. The first time I met the Toad with the whole justice shtick, I was very much not having it. But when I came back to him later, while backtracking because I didn't know where to go, I enjoyed him so much more. Imagine that! I had to backtrack through levels I had already gone through looking for something to progress without really knowing what I was looking for, and I was having more fun than the first time because of the dialogue. In fact, I ended up thoroughly enjoying all 3 key Toads. I even, dare I say, wished that at least one of them could have become a partner on my team. I wish that they had more interesting designs or even actual names that weren't just their species, but as it stands, these were surprisingly fun characters. Oh yeah, also the main story was pretty much non-existent. Now, paper-wise, it was pretty much on par with Sticker Star. The whole game was very paper-based. There were maybe less jokes based strictly on, oh, we're made out of paper, but that was balanced out by a lot of jokes based on some of the paper mechanics, like enemies stacking up together or getting soaked in water. But even in this new spiral of positivity, there was still the battle system. I won't go on about it for too long. I'll just say that it had all the same issues as Sticker Stars, but with a much less convenient way to access your attacks. And in the end, the reason I stopped playing was because I got to the first boss, found out that I didn't have the arbitrary item I needed to actually defeat him, and didn't want to do any more battling. Ultimately, the battle system felt like Paper Mario was attempting to change away from the old formula enough to consider this different, but didn't actually want to change away enough to make it better. It's like if you folded the Mona Lisa into an origami crane. That one was a bit of a stretch. Origami King began like any other Paper Mario. Slowly. I really should have just stopped mentioning it by this point, but whatever, sue me, we got through them all. Despite the slow start, I enjoyed the beginning quite a lot. Olivia was great, the cutscenes were enjoyable, there was Bowser, so 10 out of 10 already. But let's just cut to the chase. The battle system was fine, much better than Color Splash. In fact, it's the best of the 3 modern titles, but I'm still not a huge fan of it. Here, first strikes feel completely worthless because it usually only takes 1 attack to defeat an enemy anyway, but also you already have to group up enemies, so it doesn't matter how much health one enemy has. Even if you beat one enemy faster than the others, you still have to do another attack to get the rest of the group. It just doesn't save any time, and it just doesn't feel satisfying. It also didn't help that the first battle was way too long for a tutorial battle because Olivia walked you through every single step. And the second battle did the same tutorial again. And then the next few battles after that also had tutorials in them. By the end of it, I was completely done with combat. Which is why it's good that that's when the game introduced the paper mache battles. I already knew going in that these would be more fun than the regular battles, and, well, they were. No surprises there. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite the perfect combat alternative that I would have liked. The few battles I did already got a bit samey. If this was the main combat system for future games, then there'd have to be a lot more variety, I think. And hopefully the easier enemies would take less than 4 hits, but I still liked it a lot more than the puzzle combat, even after returning to that style later. I mean, it wasn't as annoying once all the tutorials were done, but it was still something I avoided doing if I could. Even the boss battles were just fine, as long as I was actually able to figure out what I needed to do. As for all the story-related stuff, the characters and dialogue were still a ton of fun, and the overarching story was, well, honestly, I thought it was on par with the first 2 games. In fact, I might have liked Origami King's main plot more than I did 64's. Unfortunately, I just don't have a whole lot more to talk about with Origami King specifically. It's a great game, don't get me wrong, but I feel like it'll be a whole lot easier to just talk about it more by comparing it to the other games. So now that we've gone through each, let's consolidate and compare everything we've learned on the RPGs, action adventures, and Super Paper Mario. Now, let me be clear. I don't think the newer Paper Mario titles are strict downgrades in all regards, like a lot of fans of the older games seem to think. I mean, people love bringing up the sales of each game and being like, look, Color Splash sucked balls, but even sales-wise, the games are all about equal because they all sold equally well for the console they were on. Super Paper Mario was on the Wii, so it sold the most, and Color Splash was on the Wii U, so it sold the least. But even though I think they're comparable in most regards, the combat of the action-adventure titles just isn't good. My favorite part of Sticker Star's combat was that I could avoid it. Color Splash just took that and made it more cumbersome. And then Origami King threw out almost everything and replaced combat with a really boring version of the old RPG combat, but locked behind the sliding Bowser puzzle from Lethal Lava Land. However, if the series is unable or unwilling to return to the combat of Thousand Year Door, then the real-time combat of the papier-mâché battles seems incredibly promising, at least compared to the other options from newer titles. But I just think Paper Mario is currently not committing hard enough to one option or the other. The modern combat is both way too much like the RPG combat and way too little like it, so they just need to figure out which way they're gonna go with, and actually do that. Or, you know... Okay, yeah, this is probably a biased opinion, but if the modern games are trying to blend action-adventure with RPG, then Super Paper Mario was already what they wanted. If they aren't trying to have any RPG-related mechanics in the combat, then 1, they're doing a really bad job of that, but 2, Super Paper Mario was already way closer to that goal than anything they've done since. The developers of the newer games keep saying that these aren't RPGs, and yet every game since Super Paper Mario has added back more RPG systems. The only thing that Super has is a level up system, which I'd argue is far less exclusive to RPGs than turn-based battles are, or at least that just being able to level up would not be similar enough to the first 2 games for old fans to feel like it's just the old combat but worse. Plus, they'd need to bring back the EXP system because otherwise, it'd just be a normal platformer. Super Paper Mario with no levels, no new characters, and no story would just be normal Mario. Oh. They can't do any of the things that made Super different from a normal platformer anymore. All they can do is just... The first game was barely paper. It wasn't even called Paper Mario in Japan. Paper Mario was its localization name. But one of the few criticisms from people who played the first game back in the day was the lack of paper-related mechanics considering that localized name. Which is unfortunate since one of the biggest criticisms nowadays is the increased focus on paper. Paper Mario fans crafted their own downfall. To some degree, I can understand where older fans are coming from with their anti-paper sentiments. I barely played an average of 2 hours of each game, and the over-reliance on paper jokes already became a bit much for me. The very few paper-related jokes that happened in the original really stood out to me because of how unexpected they were. But I might even go so far as to say that I didn't particularly like the amount of paper stuff in Thousand Year Door either. Yeah, I ended up even more extreme than most fans somehow. I mean, I guess Super Paper Mario had almost no paper in it, so I suppose it makes sense. Now, I don't think that there should be as few as the first game, but I really just enjoyed when mechanics that could already be there otherwise were just given a paper flair to them. A lot of the abilities in Thousand Year Door seem to be made because of their paper relation rather than being normal abilities that are just enhanced with papery flavor. I'm also fine with characters getting creases when they're roughed up, but having the characters then say, "Oh man, I'm all creased up over here," and that's just the whole joke, it wasn't that fun. Having to uncrumple a character near the beginning of the game is charming the first time, but not the 15th. Truthfully, though, I have no direct issue with the amount of paper in any of the games. In fact, to some degree, I think the idea of an entire world where being made of paper is just a way of life is a neat concept. I just kinda wish they stopped introducing things that are very clearly not paper. If they want to do paper, they need to fully do paper. I don't want so much of the plot to boil down to NPCs saying, "Hey, I'm flat, and that is some weird alien 3D thing that I don't understand because I'm flat and paper." I feel like having everything be made out of paper could be cool, but it more often feels like that idea is hindering a lot of the creativity rather than enhancing it. I don't think it's the big main issue with the series that's stopping older fans from enjoying the newer titles completely, but I do feel like the game uses paper as a crutch too often. However, what I think is the big main issue with the series that's stopping older fans from enjoying the newer titles completely is So first, let's start with what I don't think is the issue. Going in, I was led to believe that old Paper Mario had stories, and new Paper Mario didn't. And as far as I can tell, that's just not true. I mean, in Sticker Star or even Color Splash, I could understand not liking the lack of main story when the game still starts so slowly, but Origami King definitely picked up the slack in that regard. So what are the story-related issues people might be having? Well, the lack of partners is a pretty big one. The modern titles have a lot of short-lived characters that just have their entire story transpire in one chapter. That's not necessarily bad. In fact, the partners in 64 were debatably like that too, but Thousand Year Door really helped to give value and longevity to the partners by giving them all unique dialogue in every cutscene they could appear in, keeping them involved through the whole game. Is it a lot of work? Obviously, but if Origami King proved anything, it's that having those partners around permanently is really important to people's enjoyment. Not to mention the benefits to helping keep combat fresh, which I haven't mentioned, and won't, because it didn't really matter to any of my thoughts on combat, but I don't think partners are the main issue here. I think the big point of contention is that the action-adventure titles rarely have any unique species or character designs. And, well, yeah, that's pretty clearly an issue. But ultimately, I think this is the only part of the games that would need to change for old fans to enjoy the new titles. The issue isn't with the genre of the games, or the expectations of fans, or the fact that the old games exist at all. I'd bet if the first title in the series was Sticker Star, there'd still be as many people saying, "Yeah, this is fine, but I think having more unique characters would improve the game greatly." But the issue is, instead of having to say that, old fans can just point to how the first two games did it, which is great for simplifying their argument, but makes it a whole lot easier for fans of the newer games to misconstrue as just nostalgia for the old titles. And since this is a debate on the internet, misconstrue they shall. Speaking of misconstruing arguments on the internet, though, as far as I can tell, the main points in defense of the newer titles are that people prefer this new style of gameplay and that the games are good enough as is, so they don't need to be changed, which are both fair enough points, but I think just adding more unique characters wouldn't ruin the modern titles at all. I'm by no means disappointed with the most recent games. I mean, I ended up liking some characters from Color Splash more than some from 64 or Thousand Year Door, but I still would have preferred if they looked a little more unique. Admittedly, in the case of the Key Toads, the fact that they look like normal toads until you reveal their power is part of their charm, but they would blend in just as well if all toads looked unique. And even from a business standpoint, having characters look different so that you can sell merchandise of them is such a great strategy that some franchises make nearly their entire profit off of just that concept alone. But there's one final issue that we have yet to consider. Could this even be changed? Miyamoto doesn't want Paper Mario introducing any new characters in the Mario universe. He also didn't want it to be an RPG since there was already the Mario and Luigi series, and, well, he just doesn't like elaborate stories. But Paper Mario's director, Kensuke Tanabe, doesn't want the games to be an RPG either. Even the writer of the game said that they were okay with not having a big story, so not only are there these limits on the game, but also very little desire to go against them. Mario and Luigi was hit hard too. In their most recent original game, Paper Jam, which is ironically the crossover with Paper Mario, there were a grand total of 0 new characters. No new enemies, no new allies, no new variations on characters either. There weren't even any returning characters that were made in previous entries of either series. Though not even the remakes were safe. Fully original characters were still there, but they removed the unique appearances of many of the normal Mario characters and towns. At this point, if even remakes aren't exempt from these restrictions, I don't know if... Oh. The Mario RPG remake is being seen as the savior of all Mario games loosely related to the RPG genre. It has the original characters back, but we already saw the Mario and Luigi remakes get away with that, though some of those are enemy variations of Nintendo staples, which was also already in the Mario and Luigi remakes. Maybe this isn't as much of a savior as we... Those aren't normal toads, and that's something we know Mario and Luigi couldn't do. This might actually be it. Or maybe not. We know very little about this remake, but it's already broken one of the rules that previous remakes couldn't, and that's promising. I hope this means that future spin-off titles will be given less restrictions, because even as someone who doesn't actually play any of the games, it's just so much cooler to see these new, original, weird, and wacky characters than it is to see Toads and Koopas. Plus, Alpha Dream, the team behind the Mario and Luigi RPGs, filed for bankruptcy just 5 months before the release of Origami King. Presumably too late for that game to change direction in any drastic ways, but that means there's no longer 2 RPG spin-off series with Mario in them, and Paper Mario can fill that gap again. Unless the Mario RPG remake is Nintendo's way to fill that gap. Look, the rules can change. They aren't set in stone. And even if they are, paper beats stone, so... But even if the restrictions on Paper Mario are still around, or the developers just don't want to push against them, at least choose more obscure characters from Mario. Paper Jam did that. Use some of the new enemy types from Odyssey or something. You don't have to make brand new characters to add more variety to the game. Just, like, add more variety to the game. Come on. Oh, and fix the combat. I know you can do that. Miyamoto didn't come to your offices and say, you have to make the combat so awful that it ruins the whole game for most players. Like, no. I don't care what the combat is, just fix it.